All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Is It Prophecy here on Israel National Radio, Arut Sheva, and the show is on YouTube under Messiah Hour. You can email me, messiahhour@gmail.com. We are very excited to have our guest this afternoon. He came on my first show ever of Is It Prophecy. I have a lot of favorite teachers at Aish HaTorah, but he's my favorite. What can I say? Historian and Rabbi Ken Spiro. Rabbi Spiro, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, indeed. So the last time you were on, it was around May, and we were talking about the Book of Yoel and blood moons, and it looks like that prediction came somewhat accurate about having a war within that year.
For sure. Definitely things have heated up. Absolutely, there's no question. Although it remains to be seen, we're in the middle of this whole cycle, that what's going to come at the end. We have supposed to be four eclipses, so we got two of them out of the way now. We're expecting two more still, so we'll see what happens. It's a little bit scary there for those who are into the concept, but the end is not yet there, so it's hard to say what's going to be by the time we get to next Sukkot.
Let's talk about a bit what happened in the summer, because I don't think people realize how close Israel really was to ending. The terrorists had tunnels all over. They were planning a huge attack on Rosh Hashanah that was averted. So can you just talk a bit about that? Because I think sometimes people think, well, nothing really, really bad happened, so we don't got to worry, but we were very close to the end.
Well, that's exactly the point, because we got to the threat before the threat got to us. People don't realize how significant it would have been. But, when you're dealing with Hamas, which is a sworn enemy of the Jewish people, it's in their charter. They, openly call for the death of Jews. They were planning a mega attack. You don't have peace with people like Hamas. They just take breaks to rearm and try and kill you again. So had that not happened, you want to see the hand of God in something. That's even how the parents of these three boys who were kidnapped, which is the real trigger for this whole event. To put a meaningful spin on it, they sort of were sacrificed to lead to the situation which led to this war, which led to discover these tunnels, which Israel knew. I have two sons who served in the army. I have a daughter in the army, and one of them years ago was telling me they could hear the Hamas guys when they were on the border with Gaza. He was in a paratrooper base. He said they could hear them digging underneath. So while the army and the Mossad was somewhat aware that this was going on, I don't think they had any idea of the massive level of construction. I mean, if you see the picture, this is a major construction project, dozens of tunnels, and the goal was to unleash some sort of mega attack involving hundreds of Hamas fighters who had infiltrated. And again, they weren't going to target just military targets. They would have targeted every single Jewish settlement around the Gaza area, and it would have led to, God forbid, hundreds, if not thousands of people killed or injured. So the whole thing was averted, thank God. But I don't think people really do appreciate, as you say correctly, how potentially dangerous and explosive it was. And the world has certainly forgotten about that. And now they're, want to bring Israel up on war crimes charges in the International Criminal Court for, what it did in Gaza, not recognizing that the real war crime would have been the targeting of all the civilian population around the Gaza Strip.
Now, you are obviously a well-known historian, world historian, and you have a great shirt describing enemies of the Jewish people, how each one, they attacked us and then they don't exist anymore, and we have a good friend in high places. I want to know about how Hamas is in historical context of enemy of the Jewish people, where they are, because this tunnel situation, and again, I don't think people realize this was used with funds given to them not to build schools or hospitals. They used all this money the world gave them to try to kill us. And I want to know where that stands in realms of enemies to the Jewish people.
Well, they're really in that category of, I would say, what we call Amalek. And if your listeners are aware, Amalek, who is the grandson of Esau, Jacob's twin brother, he is like sort of the hybrid, as we'd say, ultra-anti-Semite. And Amalek exists. He's like the anti-man of the Jewish people. He hates God, and he hates God's representatives, the Jewish people. And Amalek is really, Hamas is perfect, because Amalek has always been the ultimate suicide bomber. If people who know the Bible know that the first nation to attack the Jewish people when we left Egypt were Amalek. And the rabbis, when talking about it, they say, after, Israel just God just obliterated the greatest superpower in the world, Egypt. What are these people doing attacking the Jews? And they ended up, losing the battle with the Jewish people after the splitting of the sea. But the rabbinic take on it is Amalek is like a guy who jumps into a pot of boiling water. Although he burns himself very badly, he stops the boiling for a while because he was even a little bit successful and he killed a couple Jews. He sort of took away some of the fear the world had of God, God's people, and God's support for them. But he really, in that category, represents the ultimate threat to us. And although that nation of Amalek disappeared thousands of years ago, it's very clear, it says explicitly in the Bible that the Jewish people will war with Amalek from generation to generation. So the question is, how can we war with a people that doesn't exist anymore? And while they may not be an identifiable nation state, the ideology that they represent is constantly going to be at odds with the Jewish people, and it will stick up its ugly head throughout human history. And therefore, I would say that while they may not be ethnically Amalekites, any individual or organization or people or nation that sort of emulates those values, that makes its primary goal the destruction of the Jewish people, is in spirit Amalek. We see it with Hitler. Here's a guy who, from the beginning to the end, he was consistent in saying that the greatest threat to the world was the Jewish people and his ultimate enemy. He even sacrificed, you could make a good case for that, he, lost World War II because he was so obsessed with the Jews, to attack Russia before England was pacified, to divert trains that sent Jews from Hungary to their death in Auschwitz in September of 1944, as opposed to sending those trains with soldiers to stop the advancing Soviet army. So you see it with Hitler, and certainly we see it with Hamas. Their goal, as you said, this is the third time they've fought a war. The Palestinians are the highest recipients of international aid per capita of any people. That money is not going to the people in a place like Gaza. It goes to the military, terrorist, Jew-hating infrastructure of Hamas, whose sole goal it is, think about it, if that attack had been carried out, the response of Israel would have been so devastating, it would have made this recent conflict look like child's play. But in Hamas's mind, in the mind of radical Islamic, jihadis who think they're getting 72 virgins in heaven, they don't mind dying and they don't mind sacrificing their entire population. As a matter of fact, it's a win-win. This way everyone gets their virgins and the world will condemn Israel for killing civilians. So we're dealing with a very intractable and implacable enemy that really manifests the most dangerous anti-Jewish, anti-God ideology, I think, in history.
Again, you're listening to Is It Prophecy here on Israel National Radio, Root Sheva. And you can email me, messiahhour@gmail.com on YouTube. This is the Messiah Hour, and our guest this afternoon, Rabbi and historian Ken Spiro. Rabbi Spiro, what's interesting with the Nazis and Hamas is they both openly say they don't like Jews. They're very clear about that. They're honest about it. If you want to give something as credit, you could say they don't really lie. But yet, the world, do they not want to believe that they're telling the truth, or do they want to say their words, that's not what they really mean? How come the world doesn't understand this is what they want to do?
Well, it's hard to generalize what the world thinks, but in general, those people who don't really like us will overlook the politically incorrectness of Hamas. It's interesting, by the way, the difference between Hamas and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas versus Ismail Haniyeh, is they both hate us and want us dead. But Hamas is just more honest about it. With Fatah and Abbas will say in English nice things about the desire for peace and to coexist, but they really mean the exact same thing. So what Hamas has done is made it a little bit inconvenient for especially European leftists to back their claims because they're so openly hostile. But the reality is, you see what's going on exactly now in the news. I just saw today in the newspaper that they're going to be reviewing the European Union, and which country I forgot is asking for evidence to support the claim that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and it should be banned from interacting with the European Union. So what you really see is that Europe, is really continues in its animus towards the Jewish people. The Holocaust brought a little bit of a reprieve, 6 million Jews dying. That is worn off. They're back to open hostility towards us, and they're just looking for a way to get around the few inconvenient statements made by this organization that wants us dead, so they can, if not actively, passively back them or support them in their action or protect them from Israel taking action against them. So what you really see, I think in the more holistic view, if you take into consideration the big picture, we're dealing with the children of Esav, which is basically those people in Europe who hate the Jewish people, which is a tremendous population, who are aligning themselves behind the children of Yishmael, who hate us also. And normally these people are really serious adversaries of each other. I mean, you're talking about Islam versus Christianity in history, yet they recognize on a very deep subconscious level that the real, the real threat to them, not physically, but in terms of, who's the God squad, who's leading the world, is ultimately the Jewish people. So they'll put their hostility aside and they will unite to come out after us. And that's the one issue where you can get like a radical Euro leftist in a room with a jihadi and like shaking hands and holding up signs together when normally they'd be putting axes in each other's heads. So what we're really seeing now, I think, is you're seeing everyone's real true colors.
Now,
it's really starting to come out now. We're going to know really clearly whose side everyone is on, because Israel is fighting the most unambiguous struggle in the world against the greatest threat on the planet Earth, which is radical Islam. And rather than European, Christian society, which should be viewing Israel as the frontline state in this global struggle, they're shooting themselves in the foot by attacking us. It's sort of like America attacking West Germany in the Cold War when it was the frontline state against Soviet expansion into Europe.
Now, let's talk about that concept, because my understanding is that before Mashiach comes, that exactly what you described happens. You have Esau versus Ishmael, or Christianity versus Islam fight each other. They stop and they say, why are we fighting each other? Let's fight the Jews. And it looks like that is happening more and more now. So is that part of the prophecy that's discussed that will occur before the Messiah comes?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the prophecy you're referring to is basically in Ezekiel and Zechariah. It's called Gog and Magog, the War of Gog and Magog, which is described, again, keep in mind these prophets who are writing thousands of years ago are writing at a time when the modern nation states don't exist. So the terms that these places mention, Meshech and Tuval, there's much rabbinic speculation on where they are. And, of course, the technology of thousands of years ago is very different, especially military technology from today. So when they talk about vast hordes and mighty army and chariots and horses, we have to take that figuratively. We have to be careful not to read that into literally. No one's going to attack. Cavalry is going to be attacking Israel. But the overall image is one of the world uniting to attack the Jewish people, or really to prevent the Jewish people from returning to the land of Israel, and if they return, from fulfilling their mission as a light to nations. And it's generally, the simple reading of the prophecies is the world unites against Israel. But there's some very interesting opinions in Jewish tradition that the war of Gog and Magog is the children of Ishmael, which are the Arabs, and the children of Esav, which is Western European Christian civilization. They're duking it out, and Israel's sort of on the sidelines. When I first heard that years ago, I said, wait, it can't be. It's got to be one or the other. But then I realized, you hit me years ago, that's exactly what is going on today. You have this global jihadi, like I said before, attack against Western civilization, which we're talking primarily is Western Christian civilization, Europe, America. But at the same time, the only reason why countries like Hamas or Hezbollah can continue to threaten us is they're being covered by Europe, which doesn't allow Israel to respond the way it needs to respond. Israel's given a few days, a month or so, and then it becomes disproportionate response, blah, 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 and the world starts putting massive pressure. Without that, Israel would be free to totally eliminate these threats on its borders, which any normal country would do. So we're sort of stuck in a very complicated situation, but the coolest part of all, and the scariest part is exactly what the prophecies are talking about, and we see it coming true before our eyes every day as we open the newspapers or look on the internet or watch television.
Again, continuing the conversation with Rabbi historian Rabbi Ken Spiro. Rabbi Spiro, talk about the role of the United States in this prophecy, because the United States has been some of our biggest supporters for a long period of time, although currently some of the government higher officials aren't the friendliest with us per se. So talk a bit about that role, because you see that a lot of people, you've seen this personally when you lecture, some of the biggest supporters of Israel live in the United States. They're listening to this program, even though the president, John Kerry, et cetera, may not like it. So how do they feel with the prophecy that you're discussing?
So America, it's interesting. America is a very unusual country. On one hand, I always say no country is more Bible-based than the United States. I mean, it's got the Declaration of Independence. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're endowed by their Creator. Right on the money, it says, "In God we trust." In terms of this faith in God and belief in God, America still leads the Western world far ahead of Europe. And it's an interesting synthesis of that, but it has the Western Christian civilization in there, so it's very much a torn country. But historically, you're correct. It has been the country which has been Israel's strongest ally, and thank God it worked out that Israel's strongest ally is the one superpower left in the world. And there's tremendous grassroots support for Israel in the United States. It comes from the Christian right, evangelicals who, having seen prophecy being fulfilled in the last 70 years, the rebirth of Israel, reunification of Jerusalem, have lined up solidly behind Israel. It comes from the Congress and the Senate, who recognize that Israel is an island of stable democracy in a very volatile, dangerous place that's sitting on much of the world's energy supply and one of the few friends that America can count on. The problem is unfortunately the current American administration is, in my opinion, one of, if not the most hostile towards the Jewish state. And it's interesting because a lot of people don't see it because while the Obama administration has kept its promises vis-a-vis, military support for Israel and development of anti-missile systems, etc., on a political level in terms of pressure and even in terms of things being said by people by the Secretary of State. He came out with a statement a few weeks ago that my jaw just dropped. With all that's going on in the Middle East, which is just this Islamic interscene holy war between Shiites and Sunnis, and to have the Secretary of State of America say the fundamental issue that's really preventing peace in the Middle East is the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, that's unbelievable. That's one of the most dangerous ideas that could ever take off. The only thing that could be more dangerous for American support for Israel would be the notion that America is under attack because of its support for Israel, and not that America and Israel are allies in the same struggle and Israel's in the front line. So we're dealing with a very difficult administration, one that I believe is probably the most hostile towards Israel, and now we're in the most dangerous period of that administration as it's midterm, halfway through Obama's second term, when he is truly a lame duck president, and he's lost control of the Congress and the Senate, so now he can blame everything on them and really show us his true colors, not having to worry about getting the Jewish vote or anyone else's vote 2 years from now. And anyone who's familiar with, and a lot of people don't really understand Barack Obama, and I'm not an expert on him, but when I saw that movie by Dinesh D'Souza called 2016 years ago, and here's a man who came out of nowhere, he really nailed him. In a nutshell, it's clear that this man, although he grew up in a very privileged life, is a son of a rabid Kenyan Muslim anti-colonialist, and his agenda is to downsize the United States and basically destroy the notion of American exceptionalism, downsize the army, keep America from being the world's policeman, and the most dangerous part of that, besides it's really going to weaken America, is with all this evil in the world today, if the United States, which is the only superpower, which was until all the budget cuts, spending more on its defense budget than the next 15 countries in the world combined, if the U.S. takes a neutral role in world politics and confronting evil, I mean, who's going to protect us? The French, the British, the Swedes? We're in big trouble. This is a very scary period of time, not just for Israel, but really for the whole free world.
Let's talk about America as a superpower, because we see many times, as it says in the Bible, those who bless Abraham will be blessed. And a lot of people say the reason why the United States was so strong was because they were that one friend to Israel. If they stop being friends to Israel, even if it's just a neutral, even if they're not against them, will that devastate America's power on the world stage and in general, their economy, all their internal things as well?
Well, there's definitely a pattern that can be demonstrated. It's funny you asked me that question now, because I'm literally, as we speak, working on a presentation primarily for the evangelical Christians to explain this point, to show that you can actually chart statistically the rise and fall of civilizations and empires by how they treat the Jewish people. And it can really be understood on a couple levels. One is that really cool sort of metaphysical, supernatural level. I've seen a whole bunch of books and articles on websites put out by Christians showing the direct correlation between how America treats Israel and natural disasters in the United States and what happens to the economy, which is interesting. And on a more basic level, Israel's really the litmus test for what goes on in terms of a country's internal moral behavior. that healthy, stable democracies support the Jewish people and Jewish values. When a country starts going the other way, it's a sign that it's very sick internally. And that's another indication when countries lose their way. The first people to suffer when Germany goes from the most technologically, culturally sophisticated Weimar Republic to the most brutal society, arguably in all of human history, with the Holocaust. The first target's going to be the Jews, and it starts with us, but it never ends with us. And George Gilder, in his book, The Israel Test, and it's a very interesting book. He's not Jewish himself. He writes that just as the Jew within a nation is sort of the litmus test, the canary in the coal mine of how a country's doing in terms of its human rights and democratic values, Israel is the Jew amongst the nations. And it's not an accident the most dangerous rogue states in the world, like North Korea and Iran, are going to have Israel on their gun sights first and foremost. So there's really a lot of ways of understanding it. On a more metaphysical level, absolutely, it seems to be a direct relationship between how people treat the Jews and what happens to them. But even on a more practical level, the Jewish people represent certain values in the world that evil cannot tolerate, and evil will always target first.
All right, that concludes part one of my interview with Rabbi and historian Ken Spiro. Before we go to our break, I want to announce to everyone that there will be a comedy festival, the Jerusalem Festivus Comedy Festival, December 25th at the AACI, 9 p.m. on Thursday night. We're going to offer a contest. The first 5 people that could send an email to me at messiahhour@gmail.com and answer the following question: how many world championships have the Yankees won? That's our trivia question. Again, how many championships have the Yankees won? If you give me an answer, the first 5 people to messiahhour@gmail.com, we're going to hand out 2 pairs of tickets to each of the first 5. So again, that's messiahhour@gmail.com. Send me an email and get a couple of tickets, if you get it right, to the Jerusalem Festivus Comedy Festival. On the other side is part 2 with my interview with Rabbi and historian Ken Spiro. Email me at messiahhour@gmail.com. This is It Prophecy on Israel National Radio, and the show is simulcasted as Messiah Hour on YouTube.